Hey everyone, I'm happy to announce that today I finally released my big NextJS with Express and TypeScript course, where we learn how to build an amazing full-stack web application with these technologies. You can find the course at codinginflow.com/nextjs, and I will also put this link into the video description below. In a moment, I will show you a preview of this course and the amazing project we built there, and I will answer some commonly asked questions about the course contents. But make sure to watch the whole video, because at the end I have a discount code for you that will give you 20% off on the course price until end of this week, so until April 9th. As usual, I also have a refund policy in place, so in case you don't like the course, you can get a refund on the full course price up until 2 weeks after purchasing the course. So make sure to check out the course. Again, the link is codinginflow.com/nextjs, and here comes the preview of the course. Hey everyone, welcome to my big NextJS with Express and TypeScript course, where we will learn how to build a full-stack web application with these technologies. Now we will take a look at the project we will build in a moment, but first let's talk about NextJS and what's so special about NextJS that makes it worth learning this framework. So NextJS is one of the most popular React frameworks these days. It's another framework on top of React, which means that we still write React components and our normal React code that we love so much. But NextJS adds additional features on top that are really important to build production-grade websites. For example, automatic image optimization, so it resizes images to the appropriate size. This is a small but important feature. Or an integrated routing system, so you don't need something like React Router DOM to navigate between different pages. You can also build API endpoints directly in your NextJS code, which sometimes makes a separate backend server not necessary. Depends on the project. But the most important feature and the reason why so many people switch from normal React to NextJS is that you can decide for each page individually if it should be rendered on the client like a normal React or on the server with server-side rendering. And it also makes this process very easy for us developers. Client-side rendering is how we fetch data in a classic React app. If you have worked with React before, then you might know that a React website is basically just an empty HTML page, and the real data that we want to display, like different blog posts for example, are not on this HTML page at the moment when we load it into the browser. Instead, all the data is loaded using JavaScript later. So on React, you usually open a web page and then you have some kind of progress indicator, a progress spinner, while the website is making an API request to your backend server and fetches some data from there, and then after like half a second or so, we see this data on the screen. This makes these React websites feel very modern and fast, like real mobile apps. But it's very detrimental when it comes to SEO, so search engine optimization. Usually when you want to build a website, you want to have it show up in Google search, especially when you build something like a blog, for example, but also for other kinds of websites. The problem is that these search engine crawlers only see this empty HTML page I was talking about. They see this page before the JavaScript loaded the remaining data from the server, because we have the separation. We have this empty shell first and then we load the data from the backend. But this is not what these search engine crawlers are optimized for. They expect all the data to be in the HTML already when they load the page, and this is also what they index. So this means in the worst case that these crawlers don't see the content of your website because they see the empty shell before the JavaScript loaded the remaining data. And NextJS allows us to fetch data from the server before we render the page, and it gives us a lot of control over it, which brings other benefits. For example, we can set it so that it fetches all the data that we need when we compile the project, before we actually deploy the website. This means that when we compile our Next.js app, at compile time we can make a fetch request to our data source, for example our MongoDB database in this case, where our blog posts are stored. Then it loads all this data into your page and it constructs ready and finished HTML pages that can then be served in this form when the user accesses your website. So at the moment the user visits your website to open a blog post, we don't have to make this request to our backend anymore. This all happened at compile time. And this makes our websites super fast, and you will see how fast this is in a moment. But this is not the only server-side rendering strategy we have available with Next.js, and you will learn how all of this works throughout this course. I would say that these days, except for practice projects, vanilla React apps are not really used in production anymore. You always want to have a framework like Next.js. And if we take a look at the Next.js showcase under this URL, we can see that it's not just small startups that use Next.js in production. It's actually huge companies. You can see TikTok, Twitch, Netflix. These companies use Next.js in production. So it's really an amazing framework. It's my favorite one, and I think it's really powerful and worth learning. The rest of the stack we will use here will be the same as the typical MERN stack. We will build our backend with Node.js and Express, which is a very popular JavaScript framework to build backend servers. And we will store our data in a MongoDB database. And I will talk about the reason why we build a separate backend instead of using Next.js's API routes later in this video. And we will use TypeScript instead of normal JavaScript, of course, because TypeScript is a type-safe alternative to JavaScript, which is just much more suited to build larger projects with it. Alright, but now let's finally take a look at the project we will build here. So we built this little blogging website that's a bit similar to medium.com, and we will implement a ton of features and learn a lot of important concepts that you don't see right away when you see the website in action, but which are happening under the hood and are really important. Now, a blog is just an example project. The point of this course is not that everyone builds a blog with this knowledge. You can build any kind of website with it. A blog is just a good example project. Okay, so on our website here, users can sign up and create accounts and write blog posts. As you can see, it supports real Markdown. So these blog posts are formatted. We can upload images to our own server and show them in our post. And these blog posts are rendered statically. This is what I explained earlier. As soon as we compile the project, all this data is fetched from our database and put into the HTML page. And you will notice that when I click on one of these posts, it loads almost instantly. Boom. Now I am on localhost right now, which of course makes it a bit faster, but the data is coming from a MongoDB database that is not running on localhost. So we still have to make this request to our database whenever we need some data. But since the content of this blog post is fetched at compile time, we don't have to make this request at the moment when we open the blog post. This is why this is so fast. You can see when I click it, boom, it loads almost instantly. And this is really the power of Next.js. This is what makes it so great. Because page speed is a very important factor in search engine optimization. And when Google notices that your pages open very fast, then this will help your rankings. We will build our very own authentication system, so we don't have to rely on a third-party service like Firebase, for example, which can get expensive. And we can either sign in with a username and an email address and a password the usual way, or we can use a social provider like Google or GitHub, and you will also learn how you can add more social providers like Facebook, for example. Now when we click one of these social login buttons like Google or GitHub, we actually get redirected to their login flow. And this is important. There are also solutions that just open a pop-up where you can log into Google, for example. But this pop-up doesn't work if third-party cookies are blocked, which is the case, for example, by default when you open an incognito tab. Then this login flow with the pop-up won't work anymore. And I think Apple's Safari browser also has third-party cookies blocked by default. So this is not really suited for production. Instead, you should use the flow that actually redirects you to a Google or the other social providers login flow. So after selecting a Google account here and logging in, I get redirected to our web page, the same one we were on before. And now we are logged in with this Google account. We also have user profiles that we can open, and here we can upload a profile picture. So I'm gonna upload this one I have prepared earlier. We can set a display name, whatever, John the boss, that's different from our username. And about me, I like to play the guitar, for example. We can update our profile, and all of this is uploaded to our server and updated here. When I log out, this update profile part here will disappear because now we are not authenticated anymore. And if a user has written blog posts before, then they will also show up on their profile. And of course, every user can update their own blog post. So when we are logged in as the same user that has written this blog post, we can edit it. We can change the title and the slug and the summary of the post. We can upload an image for the post. Also, if the slug field down here is empty, it's automatically generated from the title, which is just a cool little feature. The slug is the relative URL the post has. So when we go back, you can see that up here we can see the slug, which is just a bit better than showing an ID here, for example. It's also better for SEO, by the way. We can upload an image that's used for the post, and this down here is a full-blown markdown editor. So we can make this text struct through, for example, changes it like this. We can add a block of code, we can add quotes, we can add different headlines and so on. We can even upload images inside the post. So we can click this button here. For example, my small coding in flow logo. It will be uploaded to our server and then shown inside the post. We also add other cool little features like an unsaved changes warning. So if I try to refresh the page now after making changes to it, we get this warning here. Changes you made may not have been saved. And we will learn how to implement this in a really idiomatic way in React using our own custom hook, but more on that later. So now when I save this post, we get redirected and we see the updated state on our page here with all the markdown intact. Now you might be wondering, didn't I say that these pages are generated at compile time and all the data is fetched at compile time? How can this be updated? This is because I implemented a more advanced fetching strategy that combines the best of both worlds. We get these statically generated HTML pages at compile time, but we still get immediate updates after we make a change, because users should be able to update a blog post, right? And you will learn all of this throughout this course. Now if I log out, of course the edit button here disappears and we can't make changes to this post anymore. If I log in as someone else, like Ferdinand, then I can also make no changes to Florian's blog post, but I can leave a comment. Let's say hi. And we will also build this whole comment system from scratch. And this is actually quite advanced because we implement pagination here. So let's add some more comments. Just give them numbers so we can see in which order they appear. As you can see, the newest one is always at the top. Now when I refresh the page, we don't see all comments right array anymore. Instead, we see the first 3 because this is the page size I set. Of course, you can make these pages bigger. I just made them small so we can see this more easily in action. As you can see, now we have this show more comments button, which loads the next page of comments. And pagination is also really important for production apps, because if there are 100 or several hundred comments here, you don't want to load all this data at once. First of all, it's just too much information on the screen, and also it's a lot of data that the client has to load at once, which is bad because they use up a lot of network data and everything loads slower. So pagination is really essential. After we have loaded the last page, we don't see this button here anymore. And hi was the first comment we made. We can also edit comments. Let's change this to 1. You can see that this now says edited. We have this cool relative timestamp here. We can also delete comments. Let's write blah. We can delete it, which makes it disappear again. And I even added a nested reply system. So if I reply to this, I'm gonna write 7.1 to see which comment this reply belongs to. Then this comment appears nested under this comment. And this is also paginated. So if I add a few more, 7.3, 7.4 and 7.5 should be enough. Refresh the page again. So we start back at page 1. Then we now see show 5 replies. And this is inspired by YouTube's comment system because there it works exactly the same. And these replies are ordered in the opposite order. So for the top level comments, we see the newest comment at the top. With the nested replies, we see the first one at the top. This is a bit tricky because now what happens if I add another reply? So the last one was 7.5, right? So what I do in this case is I add the new reply here at the bottom. Here's our load more button. And when I load this, this will simply disappear and we load the next page. This is also how YouTube behaves. So this is where I took this inspiration from. So show more replies. It loads 7.3, 7.4, and then we see 7.5, 7.6, and then the pagination is over. And here we have our pagination for the top level comments. So this works really nicely. And the comment system supports one level of nesting, also just like YouTube. So if I reply to this one here, for example, it automatically puts in the username I'm replying to. 77, but this is also nested under this comment here. So this is one level of nesting, just like YouTube works. And I think this is a really cool way to set this up. Now you might have already seen it, but the blog post page is also paginated. But this one is not paginated with this infinite loading button. Instead we have page numbers. So you learn these two important different ways of handling pagination. And the blog post section on the user profile is also paginated. But this works a bit differently because these blog posts are fetched from the server. And when we click a new page, we can see the change up here in the URL. The blog posts on the profile, on the other hand, are loaded client-side. So if I refresh the page, you will see a loading spinner here for a short moment. And this is really what makes Next.js so powerful, because on this page we combine server-side rendering and client-side rendering. And I make this decision dependent on if I want data to show up in Google or not. In this case, I want these profiles and the metadata to show up in Google. The username and the about me and all this stuff. So this data is loaded server-side. You can see once the page is loaded, the data is already there immediately. The blog posts here at the bottom, on the other hand, have this loading spinner for a short moment. They are loaded client-side, like in a classic React app, after we have already loaded the empty page into the browser. This has the benefit that we don't have to wait until this data is fetched from our server and this page here can load faster. And at the same time, I don't care if these posts down here show up in Google or not. I want the user profile to show up in Google, but we don't need this list of posts in Google. So we can just load this the old way, client-side. But one thing you should do when you do client-side rendering is use a proper fetching library. Because they take care that this client-side fetching of data works properly. Because there are some subtle bugs that you can easily implement, like race conditions or unnecessarily loading the same data multiple times in different places. We will use something called SWR, which is a really cool fetching library for React and Next.js. And you can see it in action when I load page 2. You will see a loading spinner for a short moment. And the same for page 3, of course. But now when I click on page 2 again, we don't see the spinner anymore. Because SWR caches the data. And it shows the cache data immediately. And then in the background, it goes ahead and fetches new data. So we see the latest changes if there are any. It also takes care of other stuff like deduplicating these requests and preventing race conditions. Another cool thing it can do is automatically refetching data, for example when we put focus on a tab. So let's say I activate this tab here on the left and I log out here. And the logged in user is also fetched client-side. Now when I focus the right tab again, SWR will go ahead and automatically revalidate the user. It will notice that we logged out and it updates the user state here as well. And the same of course works for logging in. So we log in on the left, we focus the right window here again, and we get logged in here as well. When we open the profile picture here in a new tab, we can see that it has roughly the size that we display it here, 200 something pixels. But the picture itself is stored at a larger size on our server, and Next.js automatically resizes it before it displays it on the screen, like I was explaining earlier. And the same is also the case for our blog post images. So let's go to the articles tab again. When we open this image here in a new tab, you can see that it has roughly the size that we display it here. But when we open it in this page, it has a larger size, even though this is just one image file stored on our server. And as you already noticed, our pages are also fully mobile responsive, so everything gets smaller when we make the windows smaller. Our articles themselves, they have this grid that changes how many items are displayed depending on the screen size. Our menu up here collapses when the screen gets small and it turns into a drop-down. Responsiveness is important. And then there are many more features that you don't see right away. And with this course, I really went the extra mile and really implement the features that you need in a real production website. For example, proper input validation. Our forms here check if the input is appropriate. So if this is not a valid email address and not a valid username and the password is too weak, then we can see these errors here in our input form, and they change at real time depending on what we type in. But this data is not only validated here on our front end in our form, it's also validated on our server because we can never trust the front end with validation. We always have to repeat this on our server. And even when we upload an image, like for a blog post, for example, we will check on our server if this is a valid image file and not some other kind of file that just has the file extension of an image, which is dangerous. And as you can see here, we will even verify the email address of the user, because you usually don't want someone to sign up with an invalid email address. The way this works is that we can type in a valid email address, for example, my recording email address, and then we can click on send code, which sends an actual validation code to this email address. And this is how this email looks. So we get it from this address, noreply@flowblog.com, which I defined myself. And we get this verification code that expires after 10 minutes. And again, we built this without relying on some third-party service like Firebase. We do this ourselves with our own Express server. Let's paste it in here, but let's make it wrong first, with an 8 instead of a 7. Let's also fix the password strength and try to sign up with this. Verification code incorrect or expired. When I use the correct one, we go ahead and sign up for a new account. Isn't that cool? Now if I try to repeat this process with the email address we already used, so let's add the same name again, codinginflow.recording@gmail.com, a password, and try send code again. This time we get an error, user with this email address already exists. The same happens when we click the forgot password button here. Then we also have to send a verification code to our email address and we can define a new password. And this will actually go ahead and invalidate all existing login sessions for this user. So the user gets logged out everywhere except for this one window where we just reset our password. This again is an important security feature. And this is also one reason why I prefer using login sessions rather than JWTs for session management. If you want to learn about all the reasons why JWTs are not really suited for logging in a user in a normal website, you can just Google "don't use JWT for login" and you will see a ton of posts explaining this in more detail to you. The most important point is that JWTs can't be invalidated. So what I just explained to you, invalidating all the existing user sessions after changing their password, is not possible by default with JWT. Now you can work your way around this by setting up a complex refresh token mechanism, but then it starts to become really complicated and it's also tricky to store your JWT securely in the web browser. A lot of YouTube tutorials use JWTs for login, but all these complex problems are often just swept under the rug, but this doesn't mean they don't exist. But here we want to build a production-ready website, so we have to do this properly. And the way sessions work is that when we log in, there is a cookie stored in our web browser with some key in it, and on our server there is a second half of the session stored in our database. And both pieces are required in order to properly authenticate a user. They have to have the cookie set and the session has to exist in our database. And when we want to force log out the user, we can just delete their session from the database. Whereas JWTs are self-contained, but this is also why this invalidation is not possible with JWTs. One argument against sessions and the reason why JWTs is become so popular is because every time we access a resource on our server, we have to check our database if the session for this user exists, right? And many people think this makes the server slower, but we will mitigate this by using a Redis database as our session storage. Redis, if you don't know, is an extremely fast in-memory database which makes the session access a matter of a few milliseconds. So the benefits of JWT is that they are much faster, doesn't really count anymore because our sessions will also be very fast. But at the same time it will be much more secure because we can force log out the user if an account was hacked, for example, and we don't have to wait until the JWT has expired. So again, if you want to read up on this topic, just Google for "don't use JWT for login" and you will find a lot of good explanations here. I'm a fan of good old sessions because they work and they are also pretty easy to implement. Alright, and one more important production feature we implement is rate limiting, which means that if a user makes too many requests to our server, we will block them. For example, when trying to log in. So let's type in invalid credentials here. We see invalid credentials. But we don't want someone to do a brute force attack by just trying to guess the password of a user over and over again. So if I keep pressing this button, I think I set this to a number of 10. Eventually it will not show invalid credentials anymore. Instead it will show this message here, you're trying too often. And now we can't log in anymore, even if I type in the correct credentials. And this will be active for a certain time frame now, for example, half an hour, half a day, whatever you set it to, and then we will be able to try again under this IP address. So again, making this website production ready and really robust was the focus when preparing this course. I don't want this to fall apart once you deploy this to production. This should actually keep working properly. Again, everything is mobile responsive. Even the pagination bar down here. As you can see, it changes its shape depending on the screen size. Now we have this kind of mobile view, which is also inspired by Google, where we only have the next button and the current page number. But when we make this bigger, we see all the pages. But I also designed it so that it doesn't show all pages if the number is too big. As you can see, it only shows page 4 to 13 right now. When I click 10, it's 5 to 14. Because we can't show 100 pages down here at once, right? The other pages are also mobile responsive, like our front page here with the logo, which changes depending on the screen size. And in order to achieve all of this responsiveness and this cool design, we use the Bootstrap library. Now I know that Tailwind CSS has been really popular recently, but I like to stick to Bootstrap because it provides all these ready-made components like these modals here that we can use. And buttons, and it takes care of responsiveness and also accessibility. Also, it's completely free to use and it just makes building websites easier. And this is why I am a fan of Bootstrap. It also has cool features like these pop-ups here that we can build. And yeah, this is why we will use it here. In this course, you will also learn about advanced React features like context or building custom hooks, and advanced Next.js features like on-demand revalidation. Those are really important topics that we will learn here. And I also try to pay attention to coding best practices and make the code clean and implement stuff like proper error handling and so on. The whole course will be structured in a logical and understandable way, so you won't be overwhelmed. And at the end of this course, we will even deploy everything, and I will show you how you can secure your server properly so that it can't easily be hacked. And we will also make it so that when we post a link to our website on social media, it will actually show a proper preview image and proper metadata. So I really paid attention to all these little details here. Now let's talk about the prerequisites of this course, because this is not a beginner course. I won't explain the basics of JavaScript, for example, and I will also use async await and don't explain how this works in detail. So ideally, you have already worked with JavaScript before. I think you are fine if you don't have experience with TypeScript, because I will explain the more specific TypeScript stuff throughout this course, but JavaScript knowledge is useful. But if you have worked with a different programming language that's similar to a JavaScript or TypeScript, then this might also be enough. Kotlin, for example, is, in my opinion, very similar to TypeScript, so you might not even need TypeScript experience. When it comes to HTML and CSS, I think it's enough if you just follow along. This stuff is not complicated. You don't have to know every tag out there in order to understand how to build layouts. You can just do what I do, and if you want to know something in more detail, you can always Google it, of course. I will also not explain the basics of the MERN stack. I won't explain why we need a server, for example. I will also not explain the concept of declarative UI that React uses. Because we cover so much ground in this tutorial and implement so many features, the setup will be a bit more fast-paced and I can't make it so beginner-friendly. If you have ever worked with any declarative UI framework before, it doesn't have to be React, can also be something like Jetpack Compose on Android. Swift UI, I think, is a declarative UI framework, or Flutter. Then you will probably be able to follow along because the concepts are very similar. If you don't have any experience with any of these frameworks, then you can watch my free MERN course on YouTube, which is the perfect prerequisite for this course. For this, just go to YouTube and type in Coding in Flow MERN, then you should find it. It's this one here. This will teach you all the basics about the MERN stack and the basics about React and how declarative UI works and state in React and all this stuff. So you can watch this one and then just come back to this course here, and then you will be properly prepared for it. However, you can also watch this beginner course afterwards if you want to fill in the gaps. That's really up to you. So React pre-knowledge is really great for this course, but you don't need any Next.js pre-knowledge. I will teach you how all these different features work. I will also show you all the software you need installed, and don't be afraid to just follow the course and fill in the gaps later. With buying this course, you will also get access to a private Discord group where you can ask questions to other people who bought the course, and I will also regularly answer questions there. So yeah, if you run into any problems, don't be afraid to ask your questions there. Okay, and lastly, I want to talk about some technology choices I've made for this course, in case you're wondering why I picked a certain technology instead of another one. For one, we will not use Next.js's API routes to build our backend server. We will build our backend server with Express. Next.js's API routes are actually not real servers, they are serverless functions. And a serverless function can't really do everything a real server can do, like Express. For example, whenever you need to maintain a connection, this is something serverless functions can't do because they shut down after they run and they have a certain amount of time they have for the execution. The main reason I picked Express is because it has a very large and mature ecosystem with tools and packages available that just work, where I wasn't really able to find good alternatives for Next.js's API routes. Also, many developers prefer to have a separate code base for the front end and the back end to have a proper separation of concerns, especially in larger projects where different teams work on the back end and the front end. And the problem with a server right in Next.js is that it's all one code base. It's one monolith, basically, which can make working on it and also testing it more difficult. But again, my main choice was because of the ecosystem of Express. And many people learning Next.js have probably some experience with the MERN stack, so they already know how Express and also Mongoose usually works. This is why I think it's a great choice for starting to learn Next.js. That being said, we will also implement an API route later in this course. You will still learn how this works, how you can set up these API routes. We will also not use the new app directory in Next.js 13. Instead, we will use the pages directory. Why? Because the app directory is still in beta, it's not production ready yet, there's still a lot of features missing, and the point of this course is to learn how to build a production ready website, which at the time of making this video isn't possible yet with the app directory. Also, the pages directory, which is stable right now, will still be used for many years to come. It will still be supported. And of course, companies still have a lot of code built with this pages directory that is in production right now. That being said, I might create an update to this course when the app directory has been stable for a while. Now, this update is not guaranteed. I don't know what life brings and if I have the time to make an update in a year or so. But if I make this update, it will be free for everyone who already bought the course. So in this update, we might refactor the existing app to the app directory, which would be pretty cool, or I might recreate the whole course with the new app directory, depending on how much changes we actually have to make. But again, this update is not guaranteed, so don't buy this course under the premise that you will get this update. See it as a possible bonus. We will also not use a state management library like Redux in this course. I think these libraries are used way too early. You usually don't need them in a small or medium-sized project. They just make everything more complicated, and I think it's much more useful to learn the tools that we have available in React properly, like context, for example. And also, since we use this fetching library that I mentioned earlier, SWR, we don't really need a state management library because SWR already manages the state of the data that we fetch from our server internally, and it makes a lot of the work that Redux does obsolete, but it's much more simple. Alright, and then I wish you a lot of fun with this course. It's a big course with a lot of features. I'm very proud of it. I'm very happy to have you started on this right now. So have fun, happy coding, and see you in the next video.